Monica says, "But what did the ghosts mean? All these years you've kept them to yourself. Did Mother know of them?" Or Clapperton says, "Your mother knew nothing about them, and I know that I never knew your mother as she never knew me. I thought that she would never understand, or that she would be jealous of the ghosts who haunted me. And I'm still of that opinion. How open one's heart when one is sure of the wrong response. How make a confession with no hope of absolution. It was not her fault. We never understood each other. And so we lived with a deep silence between us. And she died silently. She had nothing to say to me. I think of your mother when she lay dying, complete without interest in the life that lay behind her, and completely indifferent to whatever lay ahead of her." Monica says, "It's time to break the silence. Let us share in your ghosts. But these are only human beings who can be dealt with." Monica says, "Are only ghosts who can be exorcised." Well, perhaps you can exercise the influence, but beings have their choices, don't they? I know it's a metaphor, but who are they? And what do they stand for in your life? Lord Clapperton says, "And yet they've both done better for themselves in consequence of it all." He admitted as much. Fred Culverwell. Monica says, "Fred Culverwell? Who is Fred Culverwell?" Lord Clapperton says, "He no longer exists. He's Federico Gomez, the Central American. A man who's made a fortune by his own peculiar methods. A man of great importance and the highest standing in his adopted country. He even has sons following in their father's footsteps, who are also successful. What would he have been if he hadn't known me? Only a schoolmaster in an obscure grammar school somewhere in the Midlands. As for Macy Batterson," Monica says, "Macy Batterson? Who's Macy Batterson?" "She no longer exists, nor the musical comedy star Macy Montjoy. There is Miss John Cargill, the wealthy widow. But Freddie Culverwell and Maisie Batterson, and Dick Ferry too, and Richard Ferry, these are my ghosts. They were people with good in them, people who might have all been very different from Gomez. Miss Cargill and Lord Clapperton. Freddie admired me, when we were at Oxford. What did I make of his admiration? I led him to acquire taste beyond his means. So he became a forger. And so he served his term. Was I responsible for that weakness in him? Yes, I was. How easily we ignore the fact that those who admire us will imitate our vices as well as our virtues, or whatever the qualities for which they did admire us, and that, again, may nourish the faults that they were born with. And Maisie loved me with whatever capacity for loving she had, self-centered and foolish, but we should respect love, always. When we meet it, even when it's vain and selfish, we must not abuse it. That's where I failed, and the memory frets me," Charles says. "But all the same, these two people mustn't persecute you. We can't allow that. What hold have they upon you?" Lord Clapperton says, "Only the hold of those who know something discreditable, dishonorable." Monica says, "Then, Father, you should tell us about what they already know. Why should you wish to conceal from those who love you what is known so well to those who hate you?" Lord Clapperton says, "I will tell you very briefly and simply. As for Frederick Culverwell, he re-enters my life to make himself a reminder of one occasion, the memory of which he knows very well, has always haunted me. I was driving back to Oxford. We had 2 girls with us. It was late at night, a secondary road. I ran over an old man lying in the road, and I didn't stop. Then another man ran over him, a lorry driver. He stopped and was arrested, but I was discharged. It was definitely shown that the old man had died a natural death. And had been run over after he was dead. It was only a corpse that we'd run over, so neither of us killed him. But I didn't stop. And all my life I have heard from time to time, when I least expected, between waking and sleeping, a voice that whispered, 'You didn't stop.' I knew the voice. It was Fred Culverwell's. Monica says, poor father, all your life, and no one to share it with. I never knew how lonely you were, or why you were lonely, Charles says. Mrs. Cargill, what's she against you? Lord Cliverton says, I was her first lover. I would have married her, but my father prevented that, made it worthwhile for her not to marry me. That was his way of putting it, and of course, made it worthwhile for me not to marry her. In fact, we were wholly unsuited to each other. Yet she had a peculiar physical attraction which no other woman has had, and she knows it. And she still knows that the ghost of the man I was still clings to the ghost of the woman who was Macy. We should have been poor. We should certainly have quarreled. We should have been unhappy. Might have come to divorce. But she hasn't forgotten or forgiven me. Charles says, this man and this woman were so vindictive. Don't you see that they were as much at fault as you? And they know it. That's why they are inspired with revenge. It's their means of self-justification. Let them tell their versions of their miserable stories. Confide them in whispers. They cannot harm you. Lord Cliverton says, your reasoning's sound enough, but it's irrelevant. Each of them remembers an occasion on which I ran away. Very well. I shan't run away now. Run away from them. It's through this meeting that I shall at last, escape them. I've made my confession to you, Monica. That's the first step taken towards my freedom, and perhaps the most important. I know what you think. You think that I suffer from a morbid conscience, from brooding over faults I might have well forgotten. Sorry about... keep fighting off bugs here. You think that I'm sickening, but I'm just recovering. It's hard to make other people realize the magnitude of things that appear to them petty. It's harder to confess the sin that no one believes in than the crime that everyone can appreciate. For the crime is in relation to the law, and the sin is in relation to the sinner. What has made the difference in the last 5 minutes is not the heinousness of my misdeeds, but the fact of my confession. And to you, Monica, to you of all people, Charles says, I grant you all that. But what do you propose? How long, Lord Cliverton, will you stay here and endure this persecution? Lord Cliverton says, to the end. The place and time of liberation are, I think, determined. Let us say no more about it. Meanwhile, I feel sure that they are conspiring against me. I see Miss Cargill coming. Monica says, let us go. Lord Cliverton says, we will stay here. Let her join us. Miss Cargill enters and says, I've been hunting high and low for you, Richard. I have some very exciting news for you. But I suspect, dare I? Yes, I'm sure of it, Monica. I can tell by the change in your expression today. This must be your fiancé. Do introduce him. Monica says, Mr. Charles Hemington? Mrs. Cargill? Charles says, how do you do? Miss Cargill says, what a charming name. Charles says, I'm glad my name meets with your approval, Miss Cargill. Miss Cargill says, and let me congratulate you, Mr. Hemington. You are a very lucky man to get a girl like Monica. I take great interest in her future. Fancy, I've known her only 2 days, but I feel like a mother to her already. You may say I just missed being her mother. I've known her father for a very long time, and there was a moment when I almost married him. Oh, so long ago. So you see, Mr. Hemington, I've come to regard her as my adopted daughter. So much that it seems odd to call you Mr. Hemington. I'm going to call you Charles, Charles says. As you please, Miss Cargill. Lord Cliverton says, you said you had some exciting news for us. Would you care to impart it? Miss Cargill says, it's about dear Michael. Lord Cliverton says, oh, what about Michael? Miss Cargill says, he's told me all his story. You've cruelly misunderstood him, Richard. How he must have suffered. So I put on my thinking cap. I know. You've always thought me utterly brainless. but I have an idea or two, now and then. And in the end, I discovered what Michael really wanted. For making a new start, he wants to go abroad and find his own way in the world. That's very natural. So I thought, why not appeal to Senor Gomez? He's a wealthy man and very important in his own country, and a friend of Michael's father. And I found him, only too ready to help, Lord Clarendon says. And what was Senor Gomez able to suggest? Miss Cargill says, that's the surprise for which I've come to prepare you. Dear Michael is so happy. All his problems are solved. And he was so perplexed, poor lamb. Let's all rejoice together. Gomez and Michael enter. Lord Clarendon says, well, Michael, you know I expected you this morning, but you never came. Michael says, no, father. I'll explain why. Lord Clarendon says, and I learned that you have discussed your problems with Miss Cargill and then with Senor Gomez. Michael says, when I spoke, father, of my wish to get abroad, you couldn't see my point of view. What's the use of chasing half around the world for the same sort of job? You got me here in London with another Sir Alfred, who'd constitute himself custodian of my morals, and send you back reports. Some sort of place where everyone would sneer at the fellow from London, the limey remittance man, for whom a job was made. No, I want to go where I can make my own way, not merely be your son. That's what Senor Gomez sees. He understands my point of view. If you don't. And he's offered me a job, which is just what I wanted. Lord Clarendon says, yes, I see the advantage of a job created for you by Senor Gomez. Michael says, it's not created for me. Senor Gomez came to London to find a man to fill it, and he thinks I'm just the man. Gomez says, yes, it wasn't extraordinary. Lord Clarendon says, of course you're just the man that Senor Gomez wants, but in a different sense, and for different reasons, from what you think. Let me tell you about Gomez. He's unlikely to try to be custodian of your morals. His real name is Culverwell. Gomez says, my dear Dick, you're wasting your time rehearsing ancient history. Michael knows it already. I've told him about myself. I thought he'd better learn the facts from me before he heard your distorted version. But, Dick, I was nettled by that insinuation about my not being custodian of Michael's morals. That is just what I should be, and most appropriate, isn't it, Dick, when we recall that you were once custodian of my morals? Though, of course, you went a little faster than I did. Lord Clarendon says, on that point, Fred, you're wasting your time. My daughter and my future son-in-law understand that allusion. I've told them the story, an explanation of our intimacy, which they found puzzling. Miss Cargill says, oh, Richard, have you explained to them our intimacy, too? Lord Clarendon says, I have indeed. Miss Cargill says, the romance of my life. Your father was simply irresistible. In those days I melted. The first time he looked at me. Some day, Monica, I'll tell you about it.